So today I'm going to talk about character, and we're going to have a look at some ways, some sort of techniques that you can develop character. But we'll just wait for a few people to arrive. To get my notes up here. So, hello, it's lovely to see some people coming back every week. It's great. So I'm Lucy Atkins. I'm the author of Magpie Lane and 3 other novels. I had to think about that for a minute. I also woke up really early this morning, so I might not be at my most coherent. But we'll go with it. I'll do my best. We have already talked about character, so people have been with me from the beginning. We've had a session on character, but so many, when we were talking last week about tension and intrigue, so much of it came back to character. That I promised that I would do. That I promised I would do some more about character. So while we're just getting together, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the character who drives Magpie Lane. She is a nanny. She's in her 40s and she's Scottish, and she's extremely clever. And she's being interviewed by the police about the disappearance of the daughter of a president of an Oxford college who she's gone to work with. She's been with this family for 7 months. And she is what I suppose, would think of as an unreliable narrator. So she's a character who when I'm writing this, I want the reader to be really intrigued by her, and also maybe a little bit unsettled, a little bit unsure. Is she telling the whole story? What's she hiding? What information is she leaving out? So that is Dee in Magpie Lane. And I would say that that it's, for me, all tension really is character, pretty much. I mean, there are tips. We talked about all of this last week, and anybody who missed last week's session, I've written it up on my website, which is just lucyatkins.com, and you can go on there, and on my blog I've written up what we talked about and some tips and things to think about when you're thinking about tension and intrigue. So for me, in Magpie Lane, the tension and intrigue is all about character. It's all coming from the voice of the character whose head you are inside, or you think you are. You're not totally sure. You're not sure what she's leaving out. And one of the things that I feel really strongly about when you're creating characters is that you as the writer have to be deeply interested in them, that there's no getting around it. If your characters even slightly bore you, they are going to bore your reader. And I think a huge part of the process for me is finding the character, digging around and rewriting and keeping going until I find the thing about them, or the things about them, that I'm really interested in, and they start to inhabit me, and then they start to feel real. So that's number one for me, is being really interested in your characters. And that sounds obvious, but I think there are so many books, you read so many books where it's a bit lukewarm, and you know that's because the writer hasn't fully discovered that character and what they're interested in. So basically, your characters, they do much more than just act out your plot, obviously. That the character is the driving force of the book. A reader does not need to like the character. I should imagine we're going to get some questions about this, because it's kind of a big issue, is whether or not readers have to like the character. I think they don't. I think they have to be very curious about the character, and they have to be very engaged with the character. But I don't think you have to like the character. If your character, here's a rule. I'm going to give you questions to ask yourself. I'm going to give you tips, and I'm going to give you a couple of exercises that you can try. But here is the number one rule that to bear in mind, whatever stage you're at. Ask yourself this question: does your character end the novel in the same state, psychologically, mentally, as they were at the beginning? If that is the case, then you've got work to do, because what you need is your character needs to change, develop, grow, discover things about themselves, and be different. By the end of the book, they have to be different. And that's known as the character arc. It's this idea that the character changes and it all moves forward, and you get this sense of something happening internally. Number one rule then is, don't allow your character to end the novel the way she or he began it. The other thing I would say is that a powerful character is never really good or simply good or bad. That if you've got a character that's just good or just bad, that's immediately bringing them down. It's limiting them. Nobody really is. I know that I am most interested. The thing that really gets me when I'm writing, I've learnt this over the course of 4 books, and I've learnt to go with it, is I'm really interested in oddballs. I'm really interested in complicated individuals, usually people who don't quite fit in, often people who are extremely clever but slightly mad, sometimes charming, sometimes completely not charming. And I know that that's what just gets me going. That's what gets me interested. This is what I want you to figure out for yourself, is what interests you. What do you find interesting? And the interesting thing is almost always complexity of some description. For me, it's the sort of the weird oddballs. For other people, it might be something else. But it's the complexity about characters that is interesting. So your job as the writer is to seek complexity in those characters, in the people you're writing. Look for the complex, difficult things and unearth them. So to do this, my lovely list makers, get out your pens, because I've got 5 ways that you can do this. 5 questions that you can ask about your character that is going to move this on. Number 1, ask, what are her, I'm saying her, could be him, but I'm just going to say her because it's easier. What are her deep-seated needs and desires? Really think about that. You don't necessarily need to know that in advance. I never really do. I find this out by writing. There are planners in the world who will find this out as they write reams of notes about the character. But for me, I start to unearth that. I don't think I've ever made a list, but I would be able to tell you, any of my main characters, I'd be able to tell you what their deep-seated needs and desires are. Number 2, what are her secrets and what are her flaws? Again, same goes with all of this. I don't think about this in advance, but I would get to know a character in writing so intimately that I would be able to tell you. And secrets and flaws for me are what make people really interesting. Number 3, what are her contradictions? So what makes a character interesting is when they're a bit unexpected, and what makes people unexpected is when they have contradictions, which we all do. So think things like, does your psychopath watch Loose Women? Does your awful businessman go and visit his granny every week with a cake? Just try and kind of uncover, those are really simplistic examples, but try and uncover the contradictions inside people, because that's what makes them real. And ultimately, you want the reader to feel that they are reading a book about real people, which again sounds simplistic, but it's so important. Number 4, what is her backstory? So really understand how your character's past has shaped her emotionally, psychically, shaped her behaviour. You need to know. You don't need to necessarily tell your reader, but you, for yourself, need to know what has gone on. And number 5, what are her goals? What does she want out of this situation, whatever the situation is that she is in, or he. So let's have to think about, where do you even begin? There are 4 places. Obviously there are probably loads more or loads less, I don't know, but I've got 4 list makers. 4 places to start this process. So number 1, these are like the ways in. This is not, the be all and end all of creating character, but this is your way into your character. Number 1, try and think about some characteristics that your character has. So things like, do they have any obsessions? Do they have any tics or habits? Do they have any oddities about them? Physical or emotional? And, just things like, what are their interests? What are they interested in? Ideally, make them interested in something that you might be interested in. When I say this, so Dee in Magpie Lane is a mathematician. I am not by any stretch of the imagination a mathematician, nor am I even remotely interested in maths, but I am really interested in the kind of people who are interested in maths, if that makes sense. So find the point of interest. So if your character is interested in something, you need to feel that is something that you can work with, because you've got to take that all the way through the book. Get to know them physically. You do not have to describe everything about your character. I think people can really over-describe, and when you over-describe, you start to direct the reader too much, and that takes away some of the reader's investment. What you want is your reader to give them a little bit. So for instance, with Dee in Magpie Lane, I think I've given you the fact that she has thick, wiry hair, and that it's gone greyish, and it used to be curly and auburn, and that she's no longer slim. I think those are possibly the only things I've told you really about her. I might have told you the colour of her eyes. But if you choose your detail right, your reader will fill in the gaps, and that's what you want. But if you just leave them completely in the dark, some writers do that, but I don't really like that very much, because I feel like I'm sort of casting around trying to find out what they look like. So be really light, take it with a really light touch. Again, I say these things as if they're assertive rules, and there are no assertive rules. You can do whatever you want, but my personal feeling is that you need to be subtle about the physical details you give, but give a few. Seek out the unexpected. So in real life, people are often really surprising, or they're contradictory. You might get someone who looks really demure and lovely and sweet, and is actually a bodybuilder, is obsessed with bodybuilding, or someone who's massive and butch and macho, but who loves sewing and knitting, and has dreams of being in Bake Off or something. Look for those contradictions and bring them to unexpected life for the reader, because that makes people feel like individuals. It makes them feel real. And again, what we were saying before, that the intrigue and the tension and what drives a book is people really believing in it and really being interested and intrigued by the characters. So that's one way to get people really interested. And I think it's worth talking, because we were talking last week about tension and suspense and things, and I think it's really worth thinking about villains. And you would think that villains are a different set of rules, that they have their own rules creating villains, but actually I would say they don't. I think the villain, my number one tip for how to create a villain is to not think about them as a villain. Villains they're just people, they're just another character. What you want to do is know your villain just as much as and deeply, and care about them as deeply as you care about your other protagonists. Your villain is going to have their own moral framework, their own scheme. Villains, I'm using villains in a very loose way, that to mean the character who is the difficult one, who's the one that's making trouble. In The Night Visitor, my last book, there's not really a villain, but the one who's making trouble is Vivian, and Vivian has her own system, her own way of thinking about the world that to her is very clear, and it's a moral system, and it may not necessarily fit with what you or I would think was the right thing to do. And that's what you need to understand. You need to understand your villain's moral system. And to a certain extent, in a way, you've got to kind of buy into it yourself, because you're writing from the inside. You don't want to be writing characters from the outside. You want to be in their heads. And to do that, you need to know, again, what we talked about before. You want to know what happened to make your villain or your difficult person the way they are. It's vital with baddies or troublemakers in the book. It's vital that you've got sympathy and understanding of some description, even if they're appalling and they behave appallingly. You need to really get who they are and why they're like that, and so does your reader. If you think about, I was just thinking about the film The Joker, that's what that is. That is your working as a novelist. That entire film is what goes on behind the scenes in a novelist's imagination as they create a bad character, or it should be. So think of the Joker as being almost like a sort of template for what you need to know about your difficult characters. You need to really understand, and you need to feel on some level, I think, you need to feel some degree of sympathy for them. And that's what makes a villain really compelling, is when the reader not only finds them scary and alarming and dreadful, but feels a bit sorry for them on some level, or at least understands them. And finally, with villains, make your villain really powerful. It sounds really obvious, but if you've got a villain who's two-dimensional or who doesn't really emerge fully formed, they lose their power. If you think about people like villains in fiction like Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes and Voldemort or Hannibal Lecter, they're all incredibly powerful, and you know that they're a real genuine threat. They're not just a crazed loon and baddie. They're somebody, they're clever, they're manipulative, they're charming, they're magnetic. So find the power in your baddie and bring it out for us. So I think that kind of covers roughly. I hope you've all got questions. I hope, so I don't have to just keep banging on. Actually, I've banged on for ages. But yeah, fire away. I am here to ask any character questions whatsoever that you may have. In the meantime, as you're thinking about questions, I haven't been watching your comments. I don't know if anyone's already asked questions. Don't think. Anyway, ask them again if you have. One thing that you can think about moving forward is, here's a little exercise that might be helpful, is to choose an event. Think about one character who's been maybe not coming alive for you in some way. Choose an event from their childhood or their distant past, and just write a page or two exploring that event. So just nothing that you're going to put in the book, but just write it down. I'll give you another one in a minute. I'll start answering some questions now because lots have come in. Tips for writing from the inside of your character when you're writing in the third person. I don't think it matters that you're in the third person. I think if you feel really distanced by that, by being in the third person, you could consider changing it and try writing it from the first person and see if that feels better to you. I think all of the things we've discussed today work, whatever you're writing, whether you're writing third or first person, it doesn't really matter. It's a question of getting under their skin and really understanding them. So I don't think I'd say anything particularly different, unless that's the one thing I would say is, if you're writing in third person and you don't feel that you're in them, try switching it around. Is this process for all the characters? Yes, it is. I mean, obviously, your primary characters, your main characters, are the ones you want to put all of, throw everything at. But I would say, pretty much anyone who appears, they need to feel real. You need to know them. But I don't think, for instance, the cleaner in Magpie Lane, I don't think I particularly knew her backstory, but I did know what she looked like, and I did know what her personality was. Do you have to like your characters? Yes, we have talked about this. I don't think you do. I think you have to believe in them, you have to be interested in them, and you have to be very intrigued by them and compelled by them. But I think likability, I've said this before, but I think straining to make your characters likable can take away their interest and make them dull, frankly. Do you find it hard to write the child in Magpie Lane? Well, yes, so the child in Magpie Lane is a silent, anxious 8-year-old, and I did wonder when I had the idea for this selectively mute child whether it would be really difficult to write someone who doesn't speak. But actually, I found, because I understood her, I understood what was happening to her, and I understood how she felt, and I understood what had happened to her previously. I didn't find it difficult, actually. I found her the easiest character to write, I think. How do you differentiate between minor and major characters, and how much detail do you give? That's an interesting question. So, you differentiate because there are going to be a small handful of characters who are the main characters, and those are the ones that all of this applies to, that you really need to understand and know. And your secondary characters, your other cast, I do believe they need to all be individual and they need to be developed. But if you start giving too much detail, it's like shining a torch on a character. When you give a lot of detail, you shine the torch, the reader's eyes go to that character, and they then expect the character to take on a big part and do something. If you're not going to do something with that character and you've shone the torch on them, you've got the reader looking at them, and then they don't go anywhere, the reader's going to feel a bit wrong-footed or cheated. So be really subtle, bring in details that make them come alive as people, as background, as instigators of things, but don't focus all your energy on them, because the reader will as well. You're in control. It's about controlling the reader's perception. 3 main characters. Thank you, fabulous. That's very nice. I have 3 main characters and then sub-characters. Is it possible to have too many sub-characters? Yeah, I think that relates to the point I've just made, that if you're trying to do too much with too many people, you're directing the reader's attention at people, and the reader's expecting them to do things, and then they don't deliver. So be a bit circumspect about how much you focus on, and keep your main focus for the ones who really matter. There's no rule, but yeah, the idea is just know what you're doing. How to release information about the physical aspect of your characters, how much and when. Yeah, but people do that. There isn't really a rule. People do that differently. They describe characters differently. Some writers are absolutely brilliant at coming up with the one fantastic sentence about the way a character looks that tells you everything you need to know about them. And some writers produce much more heavy-handed, long chunks of text about what they look like. And I think that's much harder to do, and you tend to be feeding the reader too much. So it's what I touched on earlier. I personally think that less is more, but it has to be the carefully chosen detail. Do you write your characters in different points of view before you decide on the final? Yes, sometimes I do. I think that's what I was saying earlier on about if you feel a bit distanced, try it in a different way. Yeah, I think explore it, and don't be afraid. Don't think, oh God, that's so much work, I can't rewrite those 3 chapters, because you're shortchanging yourself. What you need to do is make sure that it feels right to you. once you've got it, you're off. I wonder if you sometimes get lost in your characters. Mine seem to be staying with me during the day, and I can't wait to see what they do next. I think that's a sign that it's all coming together. When they start to do that, that's when they start to feel real. It feels like you need to meet interesting people and be alert about their stories. Otherwise, how can we be creative about thinking about an unusual character? Oh, well, unusual characters are everywhere. If you look pretty much everywhere, open a local newspaper. That's my advice. You can get stories, you can get colour, you can get that from reading anything pretty much about people. And just be alert. I think that's the thing. Be alert to the oddness of people. Okay, so I think we are actually going on for ages. I'll answer one last question. Do your characters change as you write and the story changes, or are they usually consistent from the start? They change really often, really dramatically. I've had characters that I've thought were going to be mad and bad who've turned out to be vulnerable and good. So yes, they do. They change really dramatically. Okay, we'll leave it there. We've gone on, but I think it's really important because character is everything. So if you want to know a bit more, go to my website, lucyatkins.com, where I've written this up and I've written down all those tips. And thank you for coming. And you can come over and follow me on my Instagram, which is @LucyAtkinsWriter, or you can follow me on Twitter @LucyAtkins. And yeah, you can, ask me any questions afterwards. That's fine too. It's lovely to see you all. I don't know what we're going to talk about next week. Maybe you can send me some ideas of things that you might like to talk about. I don't know how many of these I'm going to do, but it's fun. And it's so nice to see people coming back. So thank you, and see you next week at 1:30 Friday. Bye.